Hello everyone and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. In the beginning, before the day unraveled into chaos and became the story that headlines would later twist into sensational fragments like, "Only 2 returned alive," and "Horror on the Ridge," the group had woken to a sunrise so clean and bright that the sky looked freshly washed, its colors smeared in delicate streaks of rose and gold over the jagged silhouette of the Italian mountains that framed the valley below. Nothing in that soft morning hinted at disaster. Nothing in the easy laughter drifting among the hikers suggested that hours later, they would be gasping through dust clouds, clinging to crumbling stone, or screaming each other's names into a canyon that seemed to swallow sound as quickly as it swallowed hope. The ridge itself, a narrow and breathtaking path chiseled into a limestone spine above the valley, had always been marketed in travel brochures as both thrilling and unforgettable, though the descriptions never quite managed to capture the way the wind curled around it like a living thing, or the way the cliff dropped into a depth so sheer it made the stomach quiver. It was a place that made visitors feel as though they were walking along the hinge between earth and sky, balancing delicately above a world that looked distant and unreal. Perhaps that ethereal beauty dulled the hikers' instincts. Perhaps it made them forget that nature can turn from gentle to merciless in seconds. But in the early hours when they began their trek, the ridge was only beauty. The stones warm from recent sunlight, tiny mountain flowers peeking out from cracks, the air crisp with the scent of pine and distant snow. They moved in a loose cluster, friends reunited after years apart, 2 couples celebrating anniversaries, one solo traveler who had joined the group after meeting them at the lodge, each carrying the easy contentment of people who believe they are safe. By midday the wind had picked up, but that was not unusual. What was unusual, though they did not realize it at first, was the faint vibration humming beneath their boots, a tremor so subtle that it disappeared whenever they paused to adjust their packs or take photographs. Some thought it was distant construction. Others imagined it was simply the mountain settling as mountains do. Still, something about the air grew tense as though charged with static, and the sky, though still bright, developed a brittle sharpness that made colors seem oversaturated. The ridge narrowed. One of the hikers, a man named Luca, paused to tie his bootlace, pressing his hand to the ground for balance. He felt the tremor again, stronger this time, as if something beneath the surface shifted like a sleeping giant turning in its slumber. He frowned, glanced upward to call to the others, but before he could speak, the sound came. It was not a crack at first but a low, resonant groan, a long metallic moan that did not belong to stone yet was somehow born of it. The cliffs trembled. Pebbles loosened and skittered down the slope. The groan grew into a roar, a deep shuddering thunder that seemed to erupt from the very bones of the mountain. Someone shouted, "Run!" But there was nowhere to run. The ridge pinched to a single-file path with a vertical drop on either side. The hikers instinctively pressed themselves against the rock wall, fingers searching for crevices, shoes scraping desperately for traction as the tremor swelled into full violence. The ridge, once so solid, bucked beneath them with a suddenness that stole breath from lungs. Stone fractured. The world lurched. The collapse did not happen all at once. That was somehow worse. First, a portion of the outer edge sheared away with a grinding scream, plunging into the abyss in a cloud of dust and shattered limestone. The hikers watched, paralyzed, as the debris fell, listened to it clatter and echo for far too long before vanishing into silence. Then the section behind them tore free, isolating the group in a suspended stretch of crumbling path that now hung like a brittle thread. The wind howled through the widening gaps. Dust thickened the air, turning daylight into a suffocating sepia haze. Panic erupted in the group, raw, instinctive, loud. One woman sobbed uncontrollably. Another man shouted orders no one could hear over the roaring stone. Someone lost their footing and skidded dangerously close to the brink before being hauled back by the backpack strap. The hikers pressed together, fighting the primal terror that clawed at their minds, trying to calculate an escape route that did not exist. It was then that the second tremor hit, stronger, sharper, like a sudden punch. The ridge shuddered violently and a massive slab of rock above them broke loose, hurtling down the cliffside and smashing into the path with explosive force. The impact tore the group apart in a chaos of limbs and screams as the ridge split into 2 shrinking islands of stone. Half the hikers tumbled downward, some managing to cling to jutting rocks, others vanishing into the dust. The air filled with the crack and whine of collapsing limestone. In that moment of horror, When survival shrank to a desperate scramble for anything stable, Luca and another hiker named Marin found themselves stranded on the narrower island of rock, the one that seemed most precariously perched. Beneath them the abyss yawned. Above them huge fissures snaked across the ceiling of the overhang, shedding small pieces of debris like falling teeth. Marin tried to call out to the others, but the dust stung her throat, and the only answer was the grinding rumble of another approaching collapse. Luca scanned frantically for options, spotting a small alcove just a few feet away that seemed built into the rock face. Perhaps not strong enough to shelter them, but better than standing exposed. He shouted to Marin, grabbed her arm, and together they lunged for the alcove just as the ledge beneath their previous position disintegrated. They huddled inside, coughing, eyes watering, listening to the ridge crumble around them with the crushing inevitability of an avalanche. Hours passed like this, though time lost meaning in the suffocating dimness. Dust settled slowly, drifting through the air in lazy spirals. Occasionally, distant rocks would still fall, jolting them awake each time they drifted into haunted, shallow sleep. They whispered to each other to stay sane, shared stories of childhood, of careers they didn't love, of dreams they hadn't pursued. Marin admitted she had always been afraid of heights. Luca confessed he had suggested the ridge hike because he thought it would impress someone back home. Their voices were hoarse, their water nearly gone, but talking felt like a rebellion against despair. Outside the alcove the silence grew eerie. No wind. No birds. No distant voices calling for help. Just a hollow stillness that made the world feel abandoned. When rescue finally came, it was not triumphant. It was slow, tentative, and uncertain. The search teams had feared the worst, and when they spotted movement near the fractured ridge, two figures emerging like ghosts, they almost thought it was a mirage. Luca and Marin stumbled toward them, arms raised, eyes squinting against the sudden glare of sunlight that felt too harsh after the dim rubble they had endured. They were filthy, dehydrated, trembling. And behind them, the ridge that had once been a beautiful path was now a scarred, broken wound across the mountainside. The rescuers guided them to safety, wrapping blankets around their shoulders, murmuring reassurances that felt strange in the face of the devastation. Of the others only echoes remained, echoes in dust, echoes in fractured stone, echoes in the hollow spaces where laughter had existed only hours earlier. News outlets would later seize upon the story, twisting it into dramatic headlines. Only 2 returned alive. Ridge collapses after Italy tragedy. They were trapped. But none of those words, loud and sensational as they were, could capture the truth of what Luca and Marin had endured. They couldn't capture the way the mountain had seemed alive beneath their feet, or the terror of watching a path dissolve into nothingness, or the impossible silence that hung over the ruins. They couldn't capture the strange, fragile thread of hope that had kept the two of them alive. And they certainly couldn't capture the moment when Luca, sitting in the rescue tent as medics examined him, looked out at the shattered ridge and felt both survivors' guilt and gratitude twist together in his chest. What happened on that mountainside would haunt him and Marin for years, an unshakable reminder that beauty and danger often coexist in the same fragile balance, that life can tilt from ordinary to catastrophic in a single breath, and that sometimes survival is not a matter of strength or skill but of chance and stubborn will. The ridge would eventually be closed, fenced off, and studied by geologists seeking answers, but the mystery of what had triggered the collapse, an unseen fault line shifting, a silent fracture deep within the mountain's core, or something more elusive, would remain unsolved, leaving behind only speculation and stories whispered by those who dared to remember. For Luca and Marin, the truth was simpler. They had witnessed the mountain's fury, survived its collapse, and emerged with a bond forged not by choice but by shared terror, a bond that would forever remind them of the day a perfect Italian morning turned deadly and the ridge beneath them betrayed its own breathtaking beauty in a single catastrophic instant. In the days that followed their rescue, as the dust finally settled over the ruined ridge and investigators began to swarm the site with equipment that beeped and chirped like anxious birds, Luca and Marin found themselves caught in a surreal limbo between gratitude and grief. Suspended in a space where the world expected them to move on even though their minds were still anchored to the moment the mountain had collapsed beneath their feet, they became reluctant magnets for attention. Journalists calling their hotel rooms, documentary crews requesting interviews, people online analyzing their statements frame by frame as though survivors could ever recount trauma with flawless precision. and though the attention felt overwhelming, neither could deny the strange pull to make sense of what they had endured, to stitch meaning into the chaos, to understand why they alone had emerged from the dust while others' fates remained uncertain. The authorities postponed releasing a full casualty list until recovery teams completed their search, but Luca and Marin already sensed the truth lurking in the unspoken heaviness of the rescuers' faces. The ridge had not spared many, and each new day seemed to lean closer to confirming that reality. Their hotel in the valley became a hub for officials and specialists, all of whom treated the two survivors like delicate artifacts, objects to be handled gently yet urgently, as though their memories might crumble if pressed too hard. At night, the hotel seemed to echo with phantom tremors, the walls faintly shifting in Luca's imagination, and he would bolt upright, heart hammering, convinced for a moment that he was back in the collapsing alcove. Marin, in the adjacent room, struggled with the opposite affliction: numbness. She felt herself floating through each day in a disconnected haze, unable to cry, unable to sleep, unable to bridge the widening gap between what she knew had happened and what she could emotionally process. She envied Luca's nightmares; they seemed at least to acknowledge the truth, while she felt trapped in a static liminality, as though the mountain had stolen her capacity to respond. Yet they gravitated toward each other instinctively, meeting for breakfast even when neither could eat, walking through the village square even when the sunlight felt too bright, sharing long silences that somehow comforted them more than conversations with anyone else. As days passed, the Italian Geologic Authority released early findings hinting at a hidden fault line, something dormant, ancient, something no map had recorded, and speculation erupted about whether the collapse had been triggered by natural shifts or subtle water erosion or something else entirely. Conspiracy forums sprouted with claims of underground drilling, seismic weapons, even supernatural curses, as though people could not bear the idea that tragedy sometimes had no villain beyond the indifferent mechanics of the earth itself. Luca and Marin avoided these headlines, though occasionally a phrase would slip through: cataclysmic instability, unprecedented structural degradation, extremely low survival probability, and each time the words churned their stomachs in fresh waves of dread. One evening, 4 days after the collapse, they were called to a meeting with the lead investigator, a gray-haired geologist named Dr. Vittoria Salvetti, whose expression held a combination of warmth and gravity that instantly made them brace for bad news. She thanked them for their patience, for their willingness to recount the events despite the emotional toll, and then gently informed them that the search teams had reached the final accessible portion of the ridge site. The remaining missing hikers, she said carefully, were no longer presumed alive. The statement, though expected, washed over them like cold water. Luca's breath hitched, not in a dramatic gasp but in a small broken sound barely audible, while Marin stared blankly at the table as though the wood grain might rearrange itself into different words if she studied it long enough. Dr. Salvetti placed a discreet packet of grief counseling resources before them, but neither reached for it. After the meeting, they wandered into the courtyard behind the hotel, where the distant mountains stood silhouetted against a bruised lavender sky, quiet and majestic, betraying no sign of the violence they had unleashed. "It doesn't make sense," Luca finally whispered, his voice brittle. "How can something so beautiful do something like that?" Marin didn't answer at first. She simply watched the clouds drift, slow and indifferent, and then she said, "Maybe beauty isn't meant to be safe." They stayed there long after the sky darkened fully, long after the lamps flickered on, bathing the courtyard in soft amber light. For the first time since the collapse, Marin cried, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet, shuddering breaths that felt like her body was finally thawing from some internal frost. Luca wrapped an arm around her shoulders and they stood together, two trembling silhouettes against the vastness of the mountains that had reshaped their lives. In the following weeks, as authorities officially closed the ridge and fenced off the entrances to the trail, commemorative plaques began to appear in the village. Makeshift memorials formed along the riverbank, cluttered with candles, flowers, photographs, and handwritten notes from loved ones who had traveled from across the world to honor the victims. Local artists created murals depicting the ridge, once a symbol of adventure, now rendered with somber, reverent strokes. Tourists stopped taking selfies in the valley, and the laughter that once bounced along the cobblestone streets felt subdued, as though the entire town had slipped into a collective mourning. Luca and Marin, still unable to return home, attended several vigils, each one blurring into a haze of flickering candlelight and hushed voices. They heard stories of the hikers they had known only briefly, stories of birthdays celebrated the week before, of careers paused for travel, of long friendships and new romances, and each detail made the loss feel heavier, pressing into their lungs with a weight that made breathing difficult. One particularly painful night, they stood beside a woman holding a framed photo of her son, the solo traveler who had joined their group at the lodge, and she asked gently if they remembered him. They nodded. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the frame, and said, "Did he seem happy?" The question broke something inside them, not because of the answer. Yes, he had been smiling, chatting eagerly, excited for the hike. But because they realized how much those tiny memories now mattered to the families of those who would never walk the valley again. After the vigil, Luca sat alone by the river, staring at his reflection rippling in the dark water. He felt like a stranger to himself, as though the version of Luca who had stepped onto the ridge days ago had died there, and a new, quieter, more fragile version had emerged from the dust. Maren joined him quietly, her steps soft on the gravel. She sat beside him without speaking for several minutes. Then in a trembling voice she said, "I keep thinking about the moment we jumped toward that alcove. If we'd been 2 seconds slower." Luca nodded. "I know." She added, "I don't know what to do with that." After a long pause, Luca said, "Maybe we don't have to know yet." The river flowed on, unbothered, steady, eternal. When they finally prepared to leave Italy, the townspeople gathered to say goodbye, offering embraces and well wishes, their warmth a stark contrast to the cold shock of the collapse that had ripped through the community. The mayor thanked them for their courage, though neither felt courageous. They felt like survivors by accident, passengers who had stumbled off a derailed train because they happened to be standing near the exit. Boarding the plane felt surreal, like crossing a threshold between two incompatible versions of reality. The world outside the window, clouds drifting lazily beneath them, felt impossibly peaceful compared to the jagged terror etched into their memories. During the flight, Maren closed her eyes and let the hum of the engines lull her into an uneasy half-sleep, while Luca scribbled thoughts into a journal, desperate to capture the sensation of the ridge, the sound of the collapsing stone, the weight of the silence afterward, as though writing might grant him some measure of control over the disorder spiraling inside him. When they landed, they exchanged phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. Promises they meant sincerely, knowing that no one else could understand the strange, tangled bond forged by survival. And as they stepped into their separate taxis, heading toward homes that felt both familiar and foreign, both wondered the same thing. Whether healing was something that happened naturally with time, like a bruise fading, or whether it was something they would have to intentionally build, piece by fragile piece, from the rubble of the lives they once knew. Neither had the answer, but both, in quiet, tentative ways, carried with them the same unspoken determination. The collapse had taken so much, but it would not define the rest of their story. Luca and Maren found that the world around them had resumed its usual pace, oblivious to the gap the ridge collapse had carved into their inner landscapes. Friends welcomed them back with tears and embraces, yet even the most well-meaning conversations felt slightly off-key, as though everyone expected them to give a clear, concise account of what had happened, something tidy and narratively satisfying, when in reality the memory was a tangle of splintered images, deafening sounds and long stretches of paralyzed fear. Luca tried to return to work, but the clatter of construction outside his office window made his stomach flip, the vibrations echoing too closely the trembling ridge beneath his boots, and he found himself gripping the edges of his desk, waiting for the phantom shaking to pass. His co-workers, unsure how to help, offered pastries and awkward sympathy, but their kindness only highlighted the distance he felt from them. Maren struggled with similar dissonance. Grocery stores felt overwhelming, crowds made her chest tighten, and even simple decisions, what to cook for dinner, whether to meet a friend for coffee, suddenly seemed monumental, as though each choice carried hidden stakes. Nightmares visited her sporadically, not always reenacting the collapse itself but manifesting as symbolic distortions. Endless staircases crumbling beneath her feet, elevators dropping into darkness, bridges dissolving mid-step. A therapist gently told her this was normal, that the mind often spoke in metaphors when trauma was too immense to process directly, but knowing this did not make the dreams any easier to bear. Still, she attended sessions each week, determined to untangle the knot inside her. Luca, meanwhile, found solace in long walks through a nearby forest, where the air smelled of moss and earth rather than dust. The steady rhythm of moving beneath tall, rooted trees soothed him, though he avoided trails with narrow ledges or steep drop-offs, feeling his pulse spike whenever he neared an exposed edge. They texted regularly at first, checking in, sharing small victories, admitting setbacks, and sometimes they video called, talking for hours without noticing time slip by, grateful to speak with someone who didn't require explanations for the tremble in their voice or the abrupt pauses when memories surfaced uninvited. Eventually, they decided to meet in person again, choosing a quiet cafe halfway between their cities. When they saw each other, there was a moment of hesitation, then a long, grounding embrace. They spoke about healing, about guilt, about the strange pressure to use their survival for something meaningful, as though tragedy obligated them to change the world. But something in the conversation shifted as the hours passed. They found themselves laughing, genuinely, unexpectedly, at mundane stories, shared misadventures, and the absurdities of daily life. It felt like rediscovering pieces of themselves they had assumed were lost forever. Before parting, they made a plan to meet again soon, not out of obligation but out of a quiet, mutual recognition. Their lives had been reshaped by the same fault line, and though healing was slow and nonlinear, neither of them had to navigate it alone.